In model making, we use the term scribing for the process of creating a grooved line that separates two parts of equal height, such as flush aircraft panels or wood decking. Any discussion of scribed detail on model aircraft seems to elicit different opinions. One opinion declares that the panel lines on the actual aircraft aren't that prominent, and they can't be replicated to scale, so they should just be omitted. With a very opposite opinion, another group enjoys panel lines so prominent as to be obvious to the most visibly challenged. My suggestion is that you allow your documentation to determine how best to represent scribed detail. Don't try to treat every model the same. Some aircraft have more prominent panel detail than others, and many panels are in actuality overlapped, so scribing is the incorrect way to represent that separation in the first place. Allow the detail to be in character with the scale. The same panel line on a 32nd scale model wouldn't be appropriate for a 72nd model, and certainly consider omitting panel lines for 1 1/44 and smaller. Obviously, the call is yours. As an example of scale, let's consider two flush aircraft panels. The two panels butt up against each other, leaving an extremely fine line. For discussion's sake, let's use a generous 3/32 gap and scale it down to 48 scale. That would mean the gap between the panels would only be a shade less than 0.02 of an inch. Or perhaps a more familiar example would be the gap around a typical modern car door in 48 scale, which scales out to slightly over 0.03 of an inch. Either of these is much finer than any molded panel line, and so fine that they would likely be partially obliterated by final coats of paint. In cross-section, a typical molded panel line looks like this. The width is limited by the technology and the budget of the model company. Note that the bottom of the line is flat. In contrast, the cross-section of most scribe lines is a V-shape. The deeper the line, usually the wider it is. I use this to my advantage in the final method of scribing that I'll demonstrate. The tools necessary for creating scribe detail are relatively few. The most important tool is a very sharp round scribe. I use a piece of stainless steel wire held in a pin vise. For a heavier scribe, I've ground down the end of a dental instrument. Both of these will form a groove, but because plastic is soft and neither of these instruments actually remove the material, they leave a raised edge on either side of the scribe. Obviously, the deeper you go, the wider the groove and the more plastic will be raised. If I want to actually remove material, I have a very fine scribe that I've ground to shape from another type of dental instrument. All tools like this work on the same principle, basically like using the backside of a pointed blade. Because they're not round, they don't work well for scribing circular shapes. I find that a slotting file is indispensable. The three that I have all have slightly different widths. None of them are as fine as a pointed scribe, but they're great for restoring molded panel lines over curved surfaces. Because of their fine teeth, they're very smooth to use and easy to control. For additional information on Swiss pattern files such as these, check out my webpage on files. I also use a very thin jeweler's circular saw blade. The ones that I have measure 0.04 in thickness. They work well for straightening out or repairing an errant scribed line. Over the years, I've used three basic approaches: scribing in the basic structural material, scribing into a base coat of primer, and finally scribing into the painted surface itself. When I replace the raised panel lines of a kit with lines scribed into plastic, I begin by sanding the surfaces smooth. If there are some useful lines that help with layout, I might leave a hint of the raised line. Take advantage of the decision to rescribe a kit by refining joints, improving contours, and removing poorly represented molded details so they can be replaced with much better separate parts. If the surface is very flat, I can use an edge taped to the surface as a guide. Here I'm using a strip of 10,000ths brass. On an airplane, more than likely the surfaces will be curved, in which case I prefer to use tape as a guide. I like to use a double thickness of 3M fine line tape. The two pieces are layered up and a fresh edge is cut. In my hands, the 2 layers of fine line tape provide enough flexibility to adapt tightly to most curves, yet provide a substantial edge to scribe against. I start with one of the round scribes and make several passes to establish an even, well-defined line. Don't try to do it in one pass. Relax and develop a feel for the groove that you're creating. The scribe should very easily and smoothly follow the line. The groove should be deep enough to follow easily without the guide in place. Once I have the initial scribe, I remove the tape. If the line looks a little too light, I'll go through the line without the tape as a guide. Otherwise, I'll knock down the plastic raised by the round scribe with sandpaper. Then I go through the lines again to clear out the remainder of the sandings. I can repeat this process if the lines don't feel smooth or I want to deepen them. I finish up over the surface with a white scuff pad. The sequence of which lines are done first is important for a clean result, especially later when scribing in paint. I usually do the circumferential lines first because there's no chance for overrun. Lines that begin and end with a structural edge are also safe. Then you start filling in between the previous lines. Always think ahead with the question of where's this line going to end. When scribing perpendicular to an existing line, take it easy and keep your eye on the termination. The more you do, the better your sense of feel and the more confidence you'll have. It also becomes easier to recognize the patterns and develop a logical sequence. At this point, if I want to increase the depth of the groove without making it overly wide, I'd use the instrument shown earlier to actually remove the plastic. Caution is needed here so the instrument doesn't carve its own path and ruin the line. Also, since the material is actually being removed, when you get to a joint, there will likely be a little material that has to be teased out, so extra care is required here. And since we're scribing in plastic, if there's a problem, it's easy enough to fill with gap-filling CA and rescribe. Drawing templates can be useful for stock shapes. For unique shapes, you can make your own templates. If you're making your own template, plan ahead so that you incorporate guides. Ideally, I prefer to secure the position of the stencil with tape rather than risk it moving. After I prime the model, I'll go through all the lines again. The wing on this Revell 32nd scale P47 was done by scribing into the plastic. Scribing into primer produces an extremely sharp and crisp line with very little cleanup. In fact, you can let the scribe slightly groove out the underlying plastic without causing distortion. The only cleanup here is a few passes with a scuff pad. The real value of scribing into primer is that you avoid the issue of different underlying materials and joints. When scribing into plastic, it's best that the surface is a single piece of homogeneous material. It's extremely difficult to scribe a perfect line that spans joints and fillers. Especially avoid solvent cements in areas that you'll be scribing over because they'll soften the plastic. This is a real problem when you're trying to have a clean, even line around an ill-fitting closed panel or door that's been cemented shut. For example, a gear door. If you're scribing into plastic, it might even be necessary to replace the doors with a single oversized piece of sheet styrene that extends past the door line. However, you bypass this issue when scribing into primer or paint. In this example, the turret fairing on this scratch-built 48 PBY has been bent from brass sheet, then faired in using dental acrylic resin. The scribing was kept in the primer. For certain complex scribe lines, sometimes I've made the stencil from a vacuform piece. I used this method on a heavily modified cupola for a Tamiya M48. As you can see in this example, I scribed into a substantially thick coat of primer. In the previous two methods of scribing panel lines, the paint goes over the top of the scribing. But how prototypical is this? In reality, the two panels are actually separated, resulting in a thin line that disappears into black. Many modelers attempt to achieve this effect by filling the panel lines with a wash, resulting in an overly heavy rendition. Although some modelers find this desirable, it doesn't fit my image of a panel line. After moving from scribing into the plastic to scribing into the primer, I noticed that when I went slightly through the primer, I got the panel line that I was looking for. And around the same time on the Old Rec Models forum, I read a post by a fellow chastising modelers for their overdone panel lines, and stating that it was common in 72nd scale to just scribe into the paint. His claim was that it would result in the finest panel line possible. These two things coming together seemed to make sense. And once I could get my head around the fact that I would be scratching up a nearly completed model, I gave it some tests. The first model that I completed using this method appeared in a 1984 issue of Fine Scale Modeler. When I started the model, I had this look in mind, and it seemed to be the perfect method. As you can see, a lot of the panel lines have actually accumulated dust, so rather than black, the panel lines appear to be a dusty tan. The model was given an undercoat of tan and then oversprayed with olive drab. Careful pressure control allows the fine round scribe to just cut through the top color coat, leaving an extremely fine line. In my opinion, this technique produces the most prototypical result, certainly the sharpest lines. It's fast, just a few passes, and no cleaning up lines. Compare the results against the molded Hasegawa panel lines. In cross-section it looks like this compared to the earlier wash method. There's only one thing: you need to be careful not to make mistakes. It really sounds more daunting than it is, but you'll never know unless you give it a try. It's surprising that once you get going how fast and easy it is. You want to experiment with your primer and paint combinations. I usually prime with a lacquer primer and paint with Mr. Color, Model Master, or White Ensign paints. This 30-second scratch build Hawker Tempest was primed in dark gray primer, and you can see the appearance of the final panel lines. This scratch built 70-second Boeing 314 was primed in gray and overcoated with the original Alclad. The original Alclad was a wonderful material because it not only looked good, but it adhered well and was very durable. This photo of the cowling in the cell illustrates a mixture of heavy lines scribed in before the painting and lighter lines scribed after the painting. This model was a real test because of the large amount of panels and the aluminum finish, and luckily everything went like clockwork. My goal is not to have the panel lines overpower the model. I want the model to present an overall similar appearance to the real subject when viewed at a similar distance. In other words, stand back from the real airplane so that you can see the entire airplane from one end to the other without moving your head or eyes. Then do the same for your model. Do your initial observations convey a similar image? Sounds a bit upside down, scribing the panel lines into a painted surface, but that's why I suggested in the beginning to use a test model. Talking and speculating about it won't get you anywhere. You have to give it a try. I hope this video has been useful and thought-provoking. Speaking from personal experience, I always like giving a new technique a try.